A summer morning in the Rocky Mountains of Colorado began beneath an unusually clear blue sky. The first rays of sunlight stretched across endless pine forests, bathing the mountain slopes in warm golden light. No one could have imagined that within a few hours, the peaceful wilderness would become a sea of flames. A red pickup truck pulled into the ranger station. Ethan Carter stepped out, 38 years old, tall, strong. His sunburned face reflected years of battling wildfires across the mountains. As soon as he closed the truck door, familiar footsteps raced toward him. A German shepherd sprinted across the parking area. It was Max. His tail wagged excitedly while the silver collar around his neck sparkled in the morning sun. Engraved on the collar were 4 simple words, "My best friend." Ethan smiled and rubbed Max behind the ears. "Come on, buddy." Max answered with a single bark before trotting ahead, occasionally glancing back to make sure Ethan was following. Today's assignment wasn't an active firefighting mission. It was simply another routine wildfire patrol after weeks of extreme heat. The forest hadn't seen rain in nearly 3 months. Dry pine needles blanketed the ground. Every patch of dead grass had become fuel, waiting for the smallest spark. The fire roared like a giant beast, awakening from its sleep. In less than a minute, flames more than 30 feet high swallowed the pine trees ahead. Dry trunks cracked violently. Thousands of glowing embers were carried by the wind, landing on patches of dead grass and instantly creating new fires. Ethan scanned the forest. The trail he and Max had used only minutes earlier had completely disappeared behind a wall of flames. There was no way back. "Let's move," he shouted. Max immediately ran ahead, never getting too far, stopping every few yards to make sure Ethan was still following. That had always been Max's habit. He never left Ethan behind. Smoke quickly thickened. What had started as a thin gray haze soon became a suffocating blanket covering the entire forest. Every breath burned Ethan's lungs. He pulled his fire-resistant scarf over his nose and crouched low. The cleaner air stayed closer to the ground. Max instinctively lowered his head as well, squinting against the burning smoke. Suddenly, the radio crackled. "Carter! Can you hear us, Ethan?" He grabbed it immediately. "I'm here." "Max and I are trapped. The trail is gone." Only static answered him. Then silence. He checked the GPS. One message filled the screen. "Signal lost." Ethan looked at Max and forced a small smile. "I guess it's just the two of us now." Max wagged his tail once as if he understood every word. The heat became unbearable. Burning pine needles drifted down like fiery rain. A flaming branch crashed onto the trail only a few feet ahead. Ethan stepped back. Without waiting for a command, Max quietly changed direction. The two continued deeper into the forest, not because they wanted to, but because the fire left them no other choice. Nearly 20 minutes later, exhaustion began to take its toll. Their water bottle was almost empty. Ethan poured the last few drops into his hand for Max. The German shepherd drank gratefully. Then Ethan capped the empty bottle. "We have to find water. Without it, neither of them would survive much longer." At that moment, Max suddenly froze. His ears stood tall. His nose lifted into the smoky air. Then he turned sharply left. Instead of questioning him, Ethan simply followed. Several minutes later, he heard something. A faint, trickling sound. Water. Ahead lay a dried creek bed filled with white stones. There was no flowing stream, only cracked earth. Ethan's hope disappeared. But Max wasn't finished. The dog began digging furiously beside a large rock. Stone after stone flew backward. Then, a single drop of crystal-clear water appeared. Another. Then another. Within seconds, a tiny spring began bubbling out from beneath the rocks. Ethan stared in disbelief before laughing for the first time since becoming trapped. "Good boy, Max." He refilled the bottle. Both of them drank deeply. For a brief moment, hope returned. Then the ground trembled. A loud cracking echoed behind them. Ethan slowly turned around. A massive burning pine tree was collapsing directly toward the creek. "Max." They sprinted away. Only seconds later, the enormous tree crashed into the exact spot where they had been standing. Ash exploded into the air. Smoke swallowed the creek once again. Ethan looked toward the burning forest ahead. The worst was still waiting for them. The sun had almost disappeared behind a thick blanket of smoke. Although it was only early afternoon, the forest looked as dark as dusk. The sky glowed a dull orange while ash drifted endlessly through the air. Every hot gust of wind carried the sharp smell of burning pine resin. Sweat poured down Ethan's face. His fire gear felt heavier with every step. Still, Max continued walking ahead. Not too fast, not too slow. Just far enough for Ethan to keep the black silhouette of his loyal companion in sight. Every few moments Max stopped. He sniffed the air, listened, then quietly continued forward. He never panicked. Seeing Max remain calm gave Ethan the strength to stay focused. If Max hadn't given up, neither could he. About 30 minutes later, the dense forest opened into a wide valley, covered with dry grass. On any other day, it would have been beautiful. Today, it looked like an ocean of fuel. Tiny flames raced across the ground like hundreds of glowing snakes. Ethan studied the valley. Beyond it lay rocky terrain with fewer trees. If they could cross, they might finally escape the worst of the wildfire. "Let's go," he whispered. They had barely walked 100 feet when Max froze. His ears stood upright. His entire body became rigid. He stared toward the left side of the valley. Ethan followed his gaze. At first, he saw nothing, only smoke. Then, the smoke began to spin, slowly. Then, faster. Dust, ash, burning leaves. Everything twisted upward into a towering gray column. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He recognized it immediately. A fire whirl, one of the most dangerous phenomena in any wildfire. A spinning tornado of flame capable of changing direction without warning. The roaring column leaned toward them. The wind screamed. Small trees were ripped from the ground. The temperature became unbearable. "Run," Ethan turned. Max followed for only a few steps, then suddenly ran in the opposite direction. "Max," Ethan shouted. The German shepherd sprinted toward a rocky cliff. There, hidden behind scorched bushes, was a narrow crack in the rock face. Without hesitation, Ethan followed him. The moment both squeezed inside, the fire whirl exploded across the valley. A blast of scorching air rushed past the entrance. Ethan dropped to the ground, wrapping both arms around Max as burning debris flew overhead. The roar sounded like a jet engine. Rocks shook. Dust filled the air. The entire mountain seemed alive. Minutes passed, or perhaps only seconds. Time had completely lost its meaning. Finally, the wind faded. The terrible roar drifted farther away. Ethan slowly crawled toward the entrance outside. The valley no longer existed. Everything had been reduced to blackened earth. He stared silently. Had he ignored Max, neither of them would have survived. He knelt beside his loyal friend and gently wrapped his arms around the German shepherd. Max simply licked the ash-covered hand resting on his neck. Then, a deafening boom echoed across the mountain. The ground trembled once again. Ethan looked toward the cliffs. Massive boulders had begun breaking loose from the scorched mountainside. Another deadly challenge was already on its way. Massive boulders continued crashing down the mountainside. Each impact echoed through the burning forest like rolling thunder. Ethan grabbed Max and ran, doing everything he could to stay away from the cliff that was slowly breaking apart under the intense heat. Every step felt heavier than the last. Smoke burned his eyes. His throat felt raw with every breath. Even breathing had become exhausting. He knew they couldn't keep running forever. Suddenly, Max veered away from the trail. He headed straight toward a wall of gray granite at the base of the mountain. Ethan hesitated. Every instinct told him to stay on the established path. But Max had never led him the wrong way. Not once. Trusting his companion, Ethan followed. Pushing through scorched bushes, they discovered a narrow crack hidden between two giant rocks. Cool air drifted out from the darkness inside. They squeezed through. The difference was immediate. The roaring wind faded. The temperature dropped noticeably. The smoke became much thinner. It wasn't a large cave, only a small natural chamber formed by enormous granite boulders. Water dripped slowly from tiny cracks in the ceiling. The gentle sound echoed through the darkness, creating an unexpected sense of peace in the middle of a raging wildfire. For the first time in hours, Ethan sat down. Max lay beside him, breathing heavily. Ethan removed his backpack and checked what remained. One bottle of water, a small first aid kit, a flashlight, a rescue axe, a multi-tool, one final energy bar. Nothing more. He broke the energy bar in half for himself, the other half in two small pieces for Max. The German Shepherd didn't eat immediately. Instead, he looked at Ethan, waiting. Only after Ethan took the first bite did Max quietly begin eating his own portion. Even now, they shared everything. Afterward, Ethan poured a little water into his hand and gently wiped the ash from Max's face. The dog's beautiful black and tan coat had turned almost gray beneath layers of soot. His amber eyes were red from the smoke. "You're doing okay, buddy," Max answered with a slow wag of his tail. That was enough. Outside, the wildfire still painted the sky a deep crimson. It looked like an endless sunset. Ethan tried the radio one more time. "Carter calling command. Max and I are still alive. If anyone can hear me, please respond. Only static. Nothing else." He quietly lowered the radio. Years of firefighting had taught him one important lesson. Sometimes, the only thing you could truly rely on was yourself. And today, Max. Suddenly, the German Shepherd stood up, his ears locked forward, his eyes fixed on the cave entrance. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He simply listened. Ethan immediately grabbed his flashlight and rescue axe. Then, he heard it too. Footsteps. Slow. Steady. Walking outside the cave. That made no sense. No firefighter would be walking alone through an active wildfire. Max stepped in front of Ethan, standing directly between his owner and the cave entrance. Every muscle in his body tightened. The footsteps came closer. Closer. Then stopped. Right outside. Ethan held his breath. His grip tightened around the axe handle. Through the glowing red smoke, a massive, dark silhouette slowly appeared. The dark figure outside the cave lingered for only a few seconds before disappearing into the thick red smoke. Ethan didn't move. His hands tightened around the handle of his rescue axe. His heartbeat echoed loudly inside his chest. Max remained frozen at the cave entrance, shielding Ethan while staring into the smoke. A full minute passed. The footsteps were gone. Only the roar of the wildfire remained. Maybe it was just the smoke, Ethan whispered. He stepped outside and swept his flashlight across the forest. Nothing. Only burned trees, drifting ash, and glowing embers. Even so, Max refused to leave his position. He continued sniffing the air until several minutes later his ears finally relaxed. Perhaps it had only been an illusion. Or maybe a frightened animal escaping the fire. Either way, they couldn't stay in the cave any longer. Smoke was beginning to fill the chamber. The wildfire was moving closer. After packing the remaining supplies, Ethan and Max resumed their journey. Nearly 40 minutes later, the forest began to thin. The towering pines gave way to rocky cliffs and scattered shrubs. The air felt slightly cooler. Hope slowly returned. Ahead stood an old wooden ranger bridge spanning a narrow mountain creek. The rushing water below wasn't wide, but the steep canyon walls made crossing impossible without the bridge. Going around would add miles to their journey. Ethan carefully examined the bridge. From above, it looked solid. Only a few burn marks stained the handrails. He placed one boot on the first plank. Suddenly, Max stepped directly in front of him. "Move, buddy." The German Shepherd didn't move. Instead, he stared into Ethan's eyes and released a low growl. Not an aggressive growl, a warning. One Ethan had heard only a handful of times. Each time, it had saved his life. Ethan frowned. Everything looked normal. The planks weren't cracked. The cables appeared tight. Still, Max refused to let him pass. When Ethan tried walking around him, Max blocked him again, gently pushing against his leg. At that exact moment, a powerful gust swept through the canyon. Ash blew away from the bridge. A narrow crack became visible beneath the first plank. Ethan knelt down. He shined his flashlight inside. His blood ran cold. The entire wooden core had already burned away from within. Only a thin outer shell remained. One more step, and the bridge would almost certainly have collapsed beneath him. He slowly backed away and wrapped both arms around Max. "You saved me again." The German shepherd quietly licked Ethan's glove. Then, a sharp cracking sound echoed across the canyon. Both of them turned. The bridge sagged, twisted, then shattered, completely crashing into the rushing creek below. Ethan stared in silence. Without Max, he would have fallen with it. Just then, a long howl echoed from the opposite side of the canyon. Max's ears shot upright. His eyes locked onto the smoke-covered ridge. Something was watching them from the other side. The hot wind continued to sweep through the narrow canyon, carrying glowing ash with it. Ethan stood motionless for a few more seconds after the wooden bridge collapsed. Below him, the rushing current quickly swallowed the charred pieces of timber, carrying them downstream until they disappeared beneath the gray smoke. He slowly knelt beside Max and gently stroked the German shepherd's head. "Once again, you saved my life." Max didn't seem to expect praise. He simply gave a small wag of his tail before turning toward another path, silently reminding Ethan that they couldn't stop now. The wildfire was still advancing. There was no time to rest. The two carefully followed the edge of the canyon. The terrain became rougher with every step. Massive boulders lay scattered across the mountainside, many of them split open by the intense heat. Every time Ethan stepped onto a rock, he tested it carefully before shifting his weight. Years of fighting wildfires had taught him one important lesson. Extreme heat could weaken even the strongest stone. A rock that looked solid could suddenly crack beneath his boots. Ahead of him, Max continued sniffing the air. He was no longer running like he had earlier that morning. Hours of walking through scorching heat and thick smoke had slowed him down. His tongue hung from the side of his mouth. His breathing had become noticeably heavier. From time to time, Ethan called his name Max. The German shepherd immediately turned around. As soon as he saw Ethan keeping up, he calmly continued forward. Watching his loyal companion never leave him behind brought a small smile to Ethan's face. It seemed that Max had only one mission left: to guide his best friend safely out of the burning forest. Nearly 30 minutes later, the roar of the flames behind them began to fade. That didn't mean the fire had stopped. The rocky landscape simply offered less fuel than the dense pine forest. For the first time in hours, breathing became slightly easier. Ethan looked up. Through the smoke, he could finally see a small patch of sky. It wasn't blue anymore. It had turned a strange mixture of orange and gray. He pulled a compass from his jacket pocket. The needle still pointed north. After comparing it with the wrinkled paper map inside his backpack, he whispered to himself, "If I remember correctly, there should be a large mountain stream about 2 kilometers from here. If we can reach it, we might actually survive." Max answered with a soft bark, almost as if he understood every word. But reaching the stream was anything but easy. The bushes along the trail had already burned to black skeletons. Smoke continued rising from beneath fallen branches. Many pine trunks had stopped burning on the outside, yet they still cracked loudly as boiling resin exploded inside the wood. At one point, Ethan stepped over a fallen tree. The trunk suddenly split apart beneath him. A glowing bed of burning coals was hiding underneath. He instinctively jumped backward. Had his boot landed only a few inches farther, even his fire-resistant gear would not have protected him from the intense heat. He let out a long breath. It feels like the forest doesn't want us to leave. As the afternoon faded, darkness arrived much earlier than usual. Smoke blocked what little sunlight remained. Ethan switched on the small flashlight attached to his backpack. Its narrow beam illuminated rows of blackened trees. Their twisted shadows stretched across the ground like silent ghosts. The forest had become unnaturally quiet. There were no birds, no squirrels, No insects. Every living creature had either escaped or hadn't survived. Only three sounds remained: Ethan's boots crunching over ash, Max's claws tapping against stone, and the distant roar of the wildfire somewhere behind them. Suddenly, Max stopped. He looked back at Ethan, then lowered his head toward the ground. Ethan walked closer. Pressed into the thick layer of ash were enormous footprints. Not human, not deer. 4 large toes. Deep claw marks. Fresh. The edges hadn't yet been covered by drifting ash. Ethan crouched down. His expression grew serious. A black bear, he whispered. The animal was probably fleeing the wildfire just as they were. Normally, black bears preferred to avoid people, but frightened animals behaved unpredictably. A desperate bear could become extremely dangerous. Ethan unclipped the bear spray hanging from his belt. He checked the safety latch, then nodded to himself. Let's keep moving. Max sniffed the tracks carefully. His ears stayed alert, but he didn't growl. Whatever had made those prints, it was no longer nearby. About 20 minutes later, a familiar sound drifted through the smoky air: water. At first, it was almost impossible to hear. Then it became louder, stronger. Ethan stopped walking. For a brief moment, he wondered if exhaustion was making him imagine things. But Max suddenly lifted his head. His ears shot forward. Then he broke into a run. Ethan followed as fast as he could. After climbing over one final ridge of rocks, they both froze. Before them flowed a mountain stream nearly 15 feet wide. Crystal clear water rushed over smooth stones sparkling beneath the orange glow of the smoke-filled sky. Unlike the forest around it, the banks of the stream had been protected by bare rock. The flames had never reached the water. Without saying a word, Ethan knelt beside the stream. He cupped the icy water in both hands and splashed it across his soot-covered face. The cold shocked his exhausted body. For the first time all day, he felt alive again. Max hurried to the edge and drank deeply. After several long gulps, the German shepherd stepped into the shallow water and lay down with a satisfied sigh. Watching his faithful companion enjoying the cool stream made Ethan laugh. It was the first genuine laugh either of them had shared since the wildfire trapped them. But the peaceful moment lasted less than a minute. From downstream, a herd of deer suddenly burst through the trees. They raced past Ethan and Max in complete panic. None of them even glanced at the two companions. They were running from something far more terrifying. Max jumped to his feet instantly. Every hair along his back stood upright. His amber eyes locked onto the thick smoke rolling above the riverbank. A low growl rumbled deep inside his chest. Ethan slowly gripped the handle of his rescue axe. He knew one thing for certain. Whatever had terrified an entire herd of deer was far more dangerous than the wildfire itself. The herd of deer appeared for only a few seconds. They burst across the mountain stream like arrows, sending water spraying high into the air. Not a single deer slowed down. Not one of them looked back. During his years as a wildland firefighter, Ethan had watched countless animals flee from raging wildfires. But he had never seen an entire herd of healthy adult deer panic like this. There could only be one explanation. Something was chasing them. And whatever it was, they feared it even more than the flames behind them. Max remained perfectly still. His front legs lowered slightly. His eyes were locked on the thick wall of smoke drifting along the far side of the stream. A low growl rumbled deep in his throat. Ethan had learned long ago never to ignore that sound. Slowly, he removed his rescue axe from his backpack. With his other hand, he unclipped the can of bear spray from his belt. If it was a black bear, the spray would always be his first choice. The axe was only for the very last resort. Without taking his eyes off the smoke, Ethan whispered Max, "Stay behind me." But the German shepherd refused to move. Instead, he planted himself directly in front of Ethan. Every muscle in his body was tense. His amber eyes never blinked. A dry branch snapped. Crack! The sound was soft. Yet in the eerie silence of the burned forest, it echoed like a gunshot. Another branch broke. Then another. Something was coming closer. Slowly. Patiently. as though it already knew its prey had nowhere left to run. Ethan felt his heartbeat quicken, not because of fear, because his body was preparing for the worst. He drew a slow, steady breath. His eyes remained fixed ahead. Then, a massive shape emerged from the smoke. It was a fully grown black bear. Its once dark fur was now coated in gray ash. A large burn scar covered one shoulder. The animal breathed heavily, exhausted from hours of fleeing the wildfire. It paused less than 20 yards away. The bear looked at Ethan, then at Max. The entire forest seemed to fall silent. No one moved. Ethan slowly raised both hands. He avoided making direct eye contact. Years of wilderness training had taught him that staring into a bear's eyes could be seen as a challenge. Keeping his voice calm, he spoke softly. "Easy. It's okay. We're leaving." The bear sniffed the air. Standing on all fours, its shoulders nearly reached Ethan's waist. Its long claws dug into the soft earth beside the stream. Max instinctively took one step forward. Immediately, Ethan rested a hand on the dog's neck. "No, don't." He knew the truth. No matter how brave Max was, a German shepherd stood little chance against a full-grown bear. Then, the wind shifted. A fresh wave of smoke rolled through the valley. The bear lifted its head. It looked toward the advancing wildfire, then back at Ethan. In that brief moment, Ethan realized something. The bear didn't want to fight. It simply wanted to survive. Just like him. Just like Max. All three of them were nothing more than living creatures trying to escape the same deadly inferno. Very slowly, Ethan stepped backward. He never turned his back. He never ran. Max mirrored every movement, retreating one careful step at a time while keeping his eyes on the bear. The distance between them slowly increased. 20 yards, 25, 30. The bear never followed. Finally, it turned away, walked down to the stream, and drank deeply from the cold mountain water. Ethan let out a quiet sigh of relief. A confrontation that could easily have ended in bloodshed ended, instead, in silence. But the moment of relief lasted only seconds. Suddenly, Max spun toward the upstream end of the creek. This time, his reaction was completely different. He barked, loudly. Again and again. The sharp echoes bounced off the canyon walls. Ethan froze. Since entering the wildfire, Max had barked only a handful of times. Every single one had warned of deadly danger. Ethan followed the dog's gaze. The crystal-clear water was changing. At first it became cloudy, then muddy brown. Charred branches began rushing downstream. A massive burning pine log shot past in the current. Ethan's eyes widened. No. He looked upstream. Through the smoke came a deep, distant roar. It sounded like thousands of boulders crashing down a mountainside. The sound grew louder. The ground began to vibrate beneath his boots. Then he understood. The intense heat from the wildfire had likely weakened a natural mountain lake upstream. Its rocky barrier had finally collapsed. A flash flood was racing toward them with incredible force. Max run. The two of them turned and sprinted toward higher ground. Behind them, the peaceful mountain stream that had given them hope only moments earlier transformed into a deafening wall of water. Within seconds, it would become another deadly force of nature fighting to claim their lives. The roar of rushing water grew louder with every passing second. At first, it sounded like distant thunder echoing through the mountains. Only moments later, it became the deafening roar of an entire mountainside collapsing. "Move, Max," Ethan shouted. The two of them poured every ounce of strength they had into climbing the steep slope. The ground was covered with loose ash, making every step dangerously slippery. His heavy firefighting boots sank into the scorched soil that had been baking beneath the wildfire for hours. Max ran ahead. For the first time since their ordeal began, he never looked back. Perhaps even he understood how little time they had left. A tremendous crash exploded behind them. Ethan glanced over his shoulder. A towering wall of water had burst into the canyon. It was more than 10 feet high. The flood carried burning tree trunks, massive boulders, shattered branches, and thick layers of mud. The peaceful mountain stream that had saved them only minutes earlier had transformed into a raging monster. Ethan had spent years escaping flames. He never imagined that one day he would also have to outrun a flood in the middle of a wildfire. Nature followed no human logic. The moment one danger ended, another immediately took its place. The hillside became steeper. Each time Ethan reached for a rock to pull himself upward, the heat had already cracked its surface. Small fragments broke loose beneath his gloves. Smoke still covered the sky. Sweat mixed with soot and streamed down his face. His legs were beginning to shake. For hours, his body had never been allowed to recover. Every muscle screamed for rest. But stopping now meant certain death. Just a few seconds of hesitation, and the flood would swallow them both. Suddenly, the ground beneath Ethan gave way. A large section of the hillside collapsed. His footing disappeared instantly. Instinctively, he grabbed a small bush growing from the slope. Its roots were too weak. They ripped free from the earth. Ethan slid several feet toward the edge. Below him, the raging flood crashed violently through the canyon. For one terrifying moment, he had nothing left to hold on to. Then a powerful force jerked him to a stop. Max, the German shepherd, had clamped his jaws tightly around Ethan's fire-resistant sleeve. His front paws dug deep into the loose ground. Every muscle in his body strained with effort. He wasn't strong enough to pull Ethan back up, but he refused to let him fall any farther. "Easy," Ethan whispered, forcing himself to stay calm. With his free hand, he reached toward a large rock, protruding from the slope. His fingertips barely touched it. He stretched farther. Finally, his fingers wrapped around the rough stone. Slowly, painfully, he pulled himself upward. Max never loosened his grip. A few seconds later, Ethan rolled onto solid ground. The instant he did, the section of hillside where he had been hanging completely collapsed. Tons of dirt and rock thundered into the flood below. Had he been even 1 second slower, he would have disappeared with it forever. Ethan lay flat on his back, breathing heavily. His chest rose and fell uncontrollably. Max stood beside him, still holding a torn piece of Ethan's sleeve between his teeth. Despite everything, Ethan laughed. A tired, breathless laugh. "You stubborn old friend." He reached out and gently rubbed Max's head. "And you're still the best partner I could ever ask for." The German shepherd quietly licked Ethan's soot-covered hand. That tiny gesture was enough to give Ethan the strength to stand again. They continued climbing. Nearly 10 minutes later, they reached a rocky overlook high above the canyon. From there, Ethan could see the devastation below. The mountain stream had vanished completely. In its place was a violent river of brown water dozens of feet wide. Entire pine trees spun through the current like matchsticks. Massive boulders slammed into one another with explosive force. Beyond the flood, the wildfire continued spreading across the mountains. Fire, water, smoke, falling rock. The entire wilderness seemed to be attacking itself. Even after years as a firefighter, Ethan had never witnessed nature unleash so many disasters at once. He removed the soaked paper map from his backpack. One corner had become unreadable. The compass still worked, but the route he had planned to follow no longer existed. The flood had erased it. "We'll have to find another way," he said quietly. Max stood beside him, staring toward the distant mountain ridge. Suddenly, his ears shot upright. He lifted his head toward the sky. A faint, mechanical sound drifted through the smoke. Ethan listened carefully. At first, he thought his exhausted mind was playing tricks on him. Then the sound became clearer. A helicopter. His heart leaped. For the first time since becoming trapped, real hope appeared. He quickly reached into his backpack for his emergency signal flare. But before he could pull it out, the engine noise faded. The helicopter disappeared behind the thick smoke without ever seeing them. Silence returned. Ethan remained frozen. Hope had arrived, only to vanish less than a minute later. Max gently nudged Ethan's hand with his nose, as if to say, "Don't give up." Ethan took one long, steady breath. He looked toward the smoke-covered mountains ahead. Then he nodded. "Come on, buddy. We'll find our own way home." Ethan stood silently on the rocky overlook for several more seconds. The sound of the helicopter had completely disappeared. All that remained was the wind whistling through the blackened pine trees and the distant roar of the flood below. He lowered his head. That had been their first real chance of rescue, and it had slipped away just as quickly. If the helicopter had flown only a few hundred yards farther to the left, if the smoke had been just a little thinner, if he had reached for the signal flare a few seconds sooner, perhaps everything would have been different. But Ethan refused to dwell on what if. Years of fighting wildfires had taught him one simple truth. The people who survived were the ones who accepted reality the fastest. He took a slow, deep breath, then folded the worn paper map and slipped it back into his backpack. "Come on. Standing here won't change anything." Max immediately fell into step beside him. The higher they climbed, the harsher the landscape became. The dense pine forest slowly disappeared. In its place stood endless stretches of bare rock leading toward the mountain summit. Thin streams of smoke still drifted from cracks in the stone. The extreme heat had fractured the mountainside in countless places. Ethan moved carefully. Every single step had to be tested before putting his full weight down. One loose rock could send him tumbling into the canyon below. Behind them, the enormous smoke column continued rising into the darkening sky. The afternoon sun had almost vanished behind layers of ash. Time was running out. If night fell before they escaped the burn zone, their chances of surviving would become much smaller. After nearly an hour of climbing, Ethan began to feel dizzy. His legs felt as heavy as concrete. His head pounded from dehydration and smoke inhalation. He leaned against a large boulder to catch his breath. "Let's rest for a minute." Max lay down beside him, but only for a few seconds. The German Shepherd stood again and quietly walked over. He gently pressed his cool nose against Ethan's hand, as if checking to make sure his best friend was still okay. Ethan smiled. "Don't worry, I'm not giving up yet." He removed the water bottle from his backpack. Less than half remained. He took one small sip, then handed the bottle to Max. The dog drank much less than usual. When he finished, there was still plenty of water left. Ethan chuckled softly. "So now you're saving water too." Whether it was instinct or whether Max truly understood, the loyal dog simply wagged his tail. Just then, a powerful wind swept down from the north. The thick smoke rolled away for a brief moment. For the first time in hours, Ethan could clearly see the mountains ahead. He immediately raised his binoculars, scanning every ridge, every cliff, every valley. Then suddenly, his heartbeat quickened. Standing alone on a distant hilltop was an old Wildfire lookout tower. It was no more than 2 miles away. The steel structure was still standing. Although everything around it had burned black, Ethan remembered it well. Years earlier, forest rangers had used the tower to spot wildfires. Inside, there was usually an emergency radio, fresh maps, sometimes even stored drinking water. "If we can reach that tower, we'll have a real chance." He pointed toward it. Max looked in the same direction. His tail gave a hopeful wag. For the first time since becoming trapped, they had a destination. But hope rarely came without another challenge. The trail leading toward the tower had vanished. A massive crack now split the mountainside in two. The flash flood had likely triggered part of the slope to collapse. The gap stretched nearly 12 feet across. Its bottom disappeared into darkness. Ethan carefully walked along the edge, searching for a narrower crossing. There wasn't one, everywhere he looked. The gap remained just as wide, just as deadly. He slowly sat down. The tower stood only a few hundred yards away, yet it felt farther than ever. Max refused to give up. He paced back and forth along the edge of the ravine, sniffing the ground, looking over the cliff, searching. Suddenly, he barked once, then ran toward the right. Ethan followed immediately. About 50 yards away, Max stopped beside a giant fallen pine tree. The massive trunk had fallen perfectly across the chasm. Its roots still gripped the mountainside beneath Ethan's feet. Its top rested on solid ground on the opposite side. It formed a natural bridge. Ethan carefully examined it. The trunk was nearly 3 feet thick. At first glance, it appeared strong enough, but its bark had been badly scorched by the wildfire. He picked up a thick branch and struck the trunk several times. The sound echoed back solid. Unlike the burned wooden bridge earlier, this tree hadn't been hollowed out from the inside. Still, crossing it would be incredibly dangerous. One misplaced step, one strong gust of wind, and either of them would fall into the darkness below. Ethan looked at Max, then back at the fallen tree. I guess this is our only way. No sooner had he spoken than a powerful gust swept through the canyon. The enormous trunk trembled. A faint, cracking sound echoed through the air. Ethan and Max froze. Neither of them knew whether the natural bridge would carry them safely toward hope, or become the final trap waiting in the mountains. Ethan stood before the massive fallen pine tree stretching across the canyon. He took one deep breath and looked at Max. This time, let's go home. Max stepped onto the scorched trunk first. He moved carefully, placing each paw with quiet confidence. Ethan followed close behind. Far below them, the floodwaters continued to roar through the canyon. With only a few steps remaining, a powerful gust of wind swept through the gap. The trunk shook violently. A sharp crack echoed behind them. "Move!" Ethan lunged forward. Max sprinted beside him. The instant both of them reached solid ground, the enormous tree split apart and plunged into the canyon below. Ethan turned around and stared. Had they been only a few seconds slower, neither of them would have survived. The old fire lookout tower was now only a few hundred yards away. Inside, everything was covered in dust and ash. But the emergency radio was still intact. Ethan switched it on immediately. "This is Ethan Carter. Max and I are alive." For several long seconds, only static answered. Then a familiar voice broke through. "Ethan, we have your signal. Stay where you are. We're coming." A smile slowly spread across Ethan's face. For the first time in 2 days, he knew they were finally going home. About 40 minutes later, the sound of helicopter blades echoed across the mountains. This time, it didn't fly past. The aircraft landed in a small clearing beside the lookout tower. His fellow firefighters rushed toward him. Ethan didn't say a word. Instead, he knelt beside Max and wrapped both arms around his loyal friend. "Thank you. If it weren't for you, I never would have made it home." Max gently licked the soot from Ethan's face. His tail wagged happily. The long fight for survival was finally over. Several weeks later, the first heavy rains fell across the Colorado mountains. Tiny green shoots began pushing through the blackened earth. Life was slowly returning to the forest. Outside his small log cabin, Ethan sat quietly with a cup of hot coffee. Max rested peacefully beside him. The silver collar around his neck caught the afternoon sunlight. The words engraved on it still shined brightly, "My best friend." Ethan smiled and gently scratched behind Max's ears. "Come on, buddy. We've still got plenty of forests to protect." Max stood up and answered with one cheerful bark. Together they walked toward the sunlit trail. Behind them, the forest was healing. Ahead of them, a new adventure was waiting.
Thank you for joining us all the way to the end. If you enjoy heartwarming story like this one, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. We look forward to seeing you again on the next rally with Northwind.